This is an introduction to JavaScript, a browser-side scripting language. Let's see a quick overview for the JavaScript language. First, as we mentioned already, it runs on the client side, i.e. the browser. It was developed to respond to users' actions, such as clicks, mouse positions, and other events that are initiated by the user on the browser without having to go to the server. For example, we have here a very simple page that shows 3 text field elements with some numbers in them. And the moment we click on this link, a number 5 will be added to each one of them. Every time we click, a number 5 is added to each one of them. Now, normally, you would expect that this would initiate a submission to a server. The server would receive these 4 elements. It would then add the number 5 to the current values, and then it would send back HTML to the browser so that the browser would display the new values. But that's not what happens. Let's take a quick look at the source of this page. This is what generated that page. And as you see over here, we have the familiar elements of a form that contain the text boxes. And then over here we have a link that displays the add 5 to each text field, as you saw. Except that this link does not lead to any server or anything. Instead, what it does is it leads to a function call for a function that is declared in this block, and it is JavaScript. And what this function does is it picks all the elements that are named input, and for each one of them, it adds 5 to the current value. So that is how this works. Now, the important thing to remember is that this did not go to the server. So JavaScript was developed particularly for cases like these, where you would like to do some processing, but you would like to do it locally. You don't want to go to the server and wait for results to come back. So things can also work without the need for internet. Now, normally when you do web operations, you do need internet, but in this case, this would still work even if we did not have internet access, because it is executed locally. Everything that happens locally. So that is what JavaScript is about. It was developed to respond to user actions locally. So you can program responses to various events that take place on the client, that is the browser, and you may dynamically change the content or rendering of a web page. So an event such as a click might change the HTML of the document so that part or the whole document could change. Its appearance and its rendering could change as a result of a click or another event. JavaScript is object-oriented, and when looking at this code, you see that it does have the familiar constructs of an object-oriented language by treating various constructs as objects. Also, it is an interpreted language. It is not compiled. Therefore, the code runs straight as is with no compilation. Therefore, the same code will run on just about any browser that runs JavaScript without the need for compilation. It is also loosely typed, so you do not absolutely need to declare variables. You can just use them without any declaration. and their type is declared on first appearance, and it is possible to actually do recasting as needed. JavaScript is embedded in HTML. The browser does not render it. Instead, it executes it, somewhat similarly to what we've seen with PHP. The general structure is as shown over here. You have an HTML document with the regular HTML opening and closing tags, the head, the body, and so on. Anywhere in the document, but usually at the header part, you have an opening script tag and a corresponding closing script tag. And in between the two, you may have JavaScript code. So in the body, you also have HTML, which may contain calls to JavaScript functions that are defined over here in the script part. However, you're not restricted to putting JavaScript code only in the header part. It can exist anywhere. Also, it can exist in different blocks, but all the blocks of JavaScript that exist on the same page actually constitute a single program. Variables that you use in one part of a JavaScript segment are also accessible on another script segment. Syntax rules. JavaScript is case sensitive. Double and single quotes can be used to enclose strings. The difference between double and single quotes is similar to other languages. Anything that you put in double quotes can be interpolated, but anything that you put in single quotes is not interpolated, is used as is. The sequence of a forward slash and a star with a corresponding reverse sequence is used for multi-line comments. Single-line comments use 2 forward slashes. The functional statements of if statements, for and while loops are all the same as in C++ or Java. Relational operators, logical operators, and mathematical operators are all the same as in C++ or Java. Data types. Numbers, booleans, and strings are predefined data types in JavaScript. Type binding occurs at runtime, which is typical of interpreted languages, and that is also why recasting is possible. So a variable, unless it is declared specifically, its type will be bound or it will be defined on first use. What does it mean that type binding occurs at runtime? It means that unless the variable is declared by a var statement, its type is defined and is bound on first use at runtime. You can use the var keyword to declare a new variable, as is shown in these examples here. This one declares a variable found, which is set to true. So this will be a Boolean variable. This declares a variable num and assigned to number 27. Therefore, this will be cast as a integer variable, and therefore its type will be bound right at this point to an integer type. This one here declares a variable name that is set to a string. Therefore, its type will be bound to string. Variables must start with a letter or underscore followed by alphanumeric characters. Remember that it is case sensitive. So a variable which is written in capital characters is not the same as a variable that may have the exact same sequence of characters but in lowercase. You do not have to specify the data type of a variable, as we just mentioned. The types of variables are automatically converted as needed during script execution. So the following is okay. You have here a variable that is declared to have the name my underscore var, and its value is 123. Then you try over here to assign a string value to the same variable. That is okay, it will happen. The variable will be recast as a string variable. If you declare a variable as a number and then you use it in string operations, then the number will be auto-converted to string for string operations. Variables declared outside specific function definition blocks are global, and therefore they're available to all function blocks in the program. Declaring a variable within the body of a function makes it local to that function. Redeclaring a variable inside the function also makes it a new variable local to the function body, invisible from outside that function, and not related to similarly named other variables that may have been used outside that function. About string data types. Strings are a sequence of characters enclosed in matching single or double quotes. To use quotes as characters instead of the usual way that we use quotes, you must escape them with a backslash in the front. Example, you have here my string, which is taking on this whole value over here, and it contains the word champion. Now you want to have the champion enclosed in quotes. If you did not have the backslash, then this quote would terminate this quote, and this quote would be the beginning of another quotation that would be terminated over here. And so an interpreter that is trying to interpret this will understand that you have a variable here that you want to be assigned to the value he was declared. Okay, so far, but then this is not understood because the string has been terminated over here, and then this part comes after that. It would normally be assumed to be a variable, but the rest does not make sense because you would have another string over here. So the interpreter would not know what to do with this. So what you need to do is you need to backslash this quote in order to get the interpreter to understand that right here you mean this quote to be a character that is part of the character string, and so is this. So this quote is actually used as a quote for the regular quotation purposes that matches and terminates this one. But these ones are quotes that are supposed to be used as characters and as part of the whole string. In a similar way, we backslash characters that have special meaning. So the backslash characters, we usually refer to them as meta characters. So a B is a character, but a backslash B means a backspace. The backslash F means a form feed. The backslash N means a new line. The backslash R simulates a carriage return, which is the enter key on a keyboard. Backslash T means a tab, and backslash means a backslash. Because if you want just a backslash character and something else might follow that, then it might be interpreted that you're trying to actually use a meta character. So if you want to use the backslash as a character, you really have to backslash itself. So backslash backslash is just the backslash character. There are very useful operations defined on strings that are standard, and we can review some of them over here. So let's say you have a variable called name, and it is assigned the value George. This is the way the assignment goes. You just say name equals George in quotes. Now, the function length will give you the length of this variable in terms of number of characters. So since name has been declared as a string, you can use the function length to obtain its length. Now, a string of characters normally behaves like an array of characters, and that is why operations like these, like length, like obtaining a particular character at a particular position with the function char at 5 means get the character at position 5. Or you can extract a substring from the whole variable by indicating the positions from within which you would like to extract the substring. You can also change to upper or lower case by using two uppercase or two lowercase functions. You can get an integer value of a variable that has been declared as a string and parse it as an integer. In this case, the string 123, you see it's given over here as a string, enclosed in quotes, is called to be parsed as an integer. And similarly, this string over here, it is still a string, it is a number, real number, but it's enclosed in quotes, therefore it is a string. So you can parse this as a floating point number, and then it will be the real number 32.19. You can also check whether an argument that may be a string or a variable is a number or not. The function isNaN stands for is not a number. So this one here is a number, or it can be interpreted as a number, and therefore this one will return false. If this was a string consisting of alpha characters, then that could not possibly be interpreted as a number. It could not be cast as a number, and therefore it would return true, that it is not a number. Continuing with other useful functions, in the object-oriented fashion, HTML properties can be assigned to a string that will appear if the string is displayed in a web page. For example, let's say name is a variable that is a string. This will display it, render it in bold. This will render it in italics. This will render it in font size 3. This will render it in blue, strike through, superscript, or it will link it to this URL. The document object model. Since we already mentioned that JavaScript is an object-oriented language, it follows that it treats everything as objects. The whole document is an object. The whole code that generates a particular document is collectively referred to as an object. Every HTML item on a web page is treated as an object in JavaScript. For example, an image tag, such as this one over here, is an object. A button like this is an object, and so on. As we already mentioned, the name of the web page itself is an object that it is referred to as the document. Let's take a bird's eye view of what's going on here. JavaScript is an event-driven language. Events that indicate actions by a user on the browser trigger responses. Things happen, functions are executed based upon events being triggered. JavaScript is an object-oriented language. It manipulates all the elements of a web page. Based on triggers, things will happen to the various elements of a web page. Therefore, you need to be able to access the various elements of a web document. And there are two main ways to access elements. Either you access them by name or by assigning an ID to them. And because the referencing happens in an object-oriented fashion, you refer to them in this way. Let's say you have a button inside a form and they have names. So you have a button named button 1 inside a form that is named form 1. In other words, both of these have attributes called name, and the values of the corresponding names are these as shown here. So then referring to the document dot form1 dot button1 refers to that button. Obviously, every element that you wish to access by name has to have a unique name. Elements can also be referenced by assigning ID attributes to the HTML tag. Remember that within HTML tags you can define attributes, most of which are standard and they do specific jobs, but you can add as many other attributes as you like for whatever purposes you wish. So in this particular case, we have a div tag, and inside the div tag there is an attribute called ID, which is taking on the value D1. We will see shortly how these ID attributes are used. Two important methods that apply to the document object model, or DOM for short, are the retrieval of an element via an ID. So the way you would do this is you would use the following form: document dot method get element by ID, and then pass the ID, the desired ID, the specific ID of the element, as an argument to the method. Or you can retrieve all the tags, all the elements of a certain type by using the method getElementByTagName, using it in this way: document.getElementByTagName, and then pass the particular name as an argument to the method. Another important property of the DOM, of the document object model, is the inner HTML. So any element dot inner HTML refers to the HTML that is contained within the bounds of that element. Now these are intended for elements that have an opening and corresponding closing tag. So any HTML code that exists between the opening and the closing tag is referred to as the element's inner HTML. The way you use it is as follows. Here we have a variable myHTML declared, and its value is going to be the inner HTML of the element that is ID'd by the value D1 inside the document. So this goes with the previous example that we used over here. So we have a div element that opens here and closes there. Its ID is D1. The inner HTML will be this. Anything that is contained between the opening and closing HTML tags. So if this was in fact the div with the ID D1 in the document, then this would refer to this. So the string some content would then be the value of the variable myHTML. Here is an example. It's about time that we see some actual code, and we picked on this before. Here we have a form with 3 input elements, and here we have a JavaScript function. So here again we have a script tag that specifies the beginning of definition of scripting code, and it ends over here. Within this scripting code, we simply have a function definition. This function is named add5. It does not need any arguments, and the code block that defines the function starts with this bracket and ends with this bracket. In it, we have a variable that is called all inputs, and it assumes the collection of all input type of tags inside the document. So obviously, this is going to be an array. Since this is an array, we can go through all the elements of the array. So a for statement over here will loop over the elements of the array as follows. A variable I, local variable, will be defined here and initialized at 0. And the block from here to here will be executed for each value of I as it is auto-incremented and until it reaches the value length of the array all inputs. You notice here that the length function applies exactly as it did in strings earlier, because strings are in fact arrays of characters. So this one will be the length of all inputs, which means it will be the size of how many inputs we got. And arrays, and I'm running forward here, but arrays in JavaScript start also at index 0. Hence, the value of the iterator over here starts at 0. And here we have an if statement that checks the type of the particular current element. If the type is text, then its value will become whatever value it had parsed as an integer plus 5. That is the function. So for all the elements that are inputs, their corresponding values will become 5 more than they used to be. And this function will be triggered once the user clicks on this link. This will appear as a link, except that what it will do is it will not spawn a new page. It will not load a new page, but instead it will call this JavaScript interpreter and the function add5, which is defined up here. One other thing, although again I'm running ahead, this is just a function definition. When this script is first encountered, this is not going to produce anything. It's just defining the function. The function is called here. That's when it's going to be executed. If we did not have this function definition here, and we had straight executable statements, then the JavaScript statements would be in fact executed as they were encountered. So this code will render this initially, and every click will increment its value. So after 5 clicks, this is what the values would be. Other useful document methods. Documents write and write-ln methods can be used to display HTML or text in an HTML document. In fact, these statements, what they will do is they will insert whatever argument is given to them into the current HTML document. So the document's code will be augmented with these write and write-ln statements exactly where they appear. For example, I can say document write and then give this string as an argument. Then this is going to be written into the document HTML, and it will be immediately rendered by the browser. This will do a similar thing. However, after the string, it's going to insert a new line. That is not going to be interpreted by the browser, however, because the browser does not care for new lines. But if you look at the source of the code, then if you were able to look at the source of the code, then you would see a new line after that. JavaScript also comes with several other predefined objects that can be used. One is an array. So for example, you can declare a variable as an array, and you can pre-populate it to a particular array value like this. A date and math, like a mathematical random function such as a random number generator. In this example, the array was initialized with these 3 values. However, you can also initialize a variable as an array to empty. So this one here is going to be a new array of size 3, but it will be blank. Even though you specified the size to be 3, you can still add more items to the array simply by referencing the next position in the array. So an array of size 3 will contain the indices of 0, 1, and 2. The next position would be position 3. So you can specify pets 3 equals SID, and that will create a new entry in the array. The 4th element, at position index 3. Some useful array properties and methods is that you can use the length, as we already have seen. You can use the method reverse to reverse the order of the array, bring the first element last and the last element first, and the whole array reversed accordingly. Or you can sort an array, lexicographically that is. If no argument is passed, the current date and time are returned by the date method. You can also specify a date in a particular format. So this will produce the date in month, day, and year, and then time in hours, minutes, and seconds. Methods must be used to get attributes, like for example, get today's date, get day from today, get time, and so on. JavaScript functions. We saw already some example of a JavaScript function, but let's go formally into it. Functions in JavaScript have the following format. First, you need a keyword function to indicate to the interpreter that the function definition is following. You need a function name, then you need these parentheses, and you need arguments if they are going to be used. So you do not have to specify arguments. The parentheses may be empty, they're still needed, but they can be empty. But if you are going to need to pass arguments, then you would list them over here. And then within curly brackets, you're going to have a bunch of statements, which is going to be the composite statement that will be executed when this function is in fact called. Here is an example. You have function calculate total, and then you have two arguments that are passed to it, and then inside the body you have a local variable. See, the variable definition over here makes this variable here local. If a variable with the same name is used anywhere else in the program, it will have nothing to do with it. This will be a new local copy having to do nothing with anything outside the function. So this variable here will become the two arguments multiplied together, and then the return keyword is used in this statement that returns the result as the outcome of this function. Similar to Java, the keyword this can be used to refer to its element type. It returns a reference to the object or element that it is inside of. So if you use the keyword this inside a particular object or element, then the use of this will refer to that particular object or element that contains the keyword this. The little counter example on the following slide shows how it can be used. A note here that an event handler called onClick is used in this example, but we're going to see more about these later. So here is the example. We have again HTML code, and embedded in it is a JavaScript. So within the opening script and closing script tags, there is JavaScript code. Now, one thing that you might have a question about, this tag has an attribute of type, and the type of this is text/JavaScript. This is because a script does not have to be just JavaScript. It can be other types of scripts. However, these days, whenever you do not specify the type of a script, it will be automatically assumed to be JavaScript. So over here, we have some JavaScript code, and here we have an input that is a button, and it has a new attribute. Besides its name and its value, it has a new attribute. The attribute is onClick. This is called an event trigger. This will trigger something. What exactly? The execution of the function fun with argument this. This refers to this element, the input element, this button, because it is inside it, therefore it refers to this. This function is defined over here, as you see. It takes an argument item and it auto-increments the counter variable that is defined over here, and it makes the value of the item equal to the current value of the counter. So basically what this will do is every time you click on this button, this counter will be auto-incremented, and then it will be assigned as the new value of the button. Now recall that the value that you provide for a button also becomes what is rendered inside the button. So every time you click this button, its rendering is going to change to indicate the current counter value. Also, the variable counter remains active in the program, and every time you click on this item, the previous value is remembered and it is used. So this is what happens. Initially, the page is rendering with a button with just the label 0. Then on a click, this button will change and its label will become 1 because its value is going to be 1 and the button displays as its label what its value is. And then after 10 clicks, it will be rendered like this. JavaScript locations. Where do you put JavaScript? Well, you can embed it in HTML code, as we've seen already. You can put it in script tags inside the HTML document, as we have already seen. But you can also put it inside an external text file with a .js extension. This is because you might want to reuse JavaScript functions that you wrote and you would like to use them over and over again. So you might as well put all of them as a library inside an external text file and then import it to any other file as you like. You can also put it inside a tags event handler. We're going to talk about that later, but in short, the example that we had earlier, which was this one. So over here, we're going to execute the function fun if this button is clicked. So over here, we specify that the function fun is to be used, but you could put, in fact, JavaScript code straight over here. We'll see more about that later. You can also include JavaScript inside the href attribute of an anchor tag. So this is going to be a link, but it will not be pointing to a new file. Instead, it will be calling the execution of the JavaScript function fun. If you choose to put JavaScript in a .js file so that you can use that JS file as a library, then in order to use that file, you have to import it using a source attribute. So the way you use it is like this, for example. Again, you have a script opening tag and a script closing tag, but instead of having statements in between these, what you have is a source attribute inside the opening tag that refers to the location, the URL location of the JavaScript file. The file has to have a .js suffix. JavaScript code cannot be viewed inside the source of the HTML if you are including it like this, because viewing the source of the document will show you the HTML code that was received, but JavaScript code that was imported will not be shown. However, anybody who would like to get it and knows how to look for it can find it. The reason is that this one gives the location of the of the library, the JS file, and so you can copy this and paste it directly onto your browser and access that JS file. Within an HTML document, JavaScript code must be inside of the script HTML tags, as we have seen already. Now, let's take a look at this example code. This one defines the start of a script, which happens to be inside the body. See, so far, when we were defining functions and stuff, we had these script tags actually appear before the body tag, in the header part of the document. But you can put them anywhere you want. Now, this in particular is not defining any function. This one is straight executable code that is intended to be executed on encountering it. So we have the script tags, and then we have a variable definition as a string, and then we have this statement, which is a write-len executable statement. So what this is going to do is it will be executed when encountered right here, and so the script block will be replaced with what this produces. And what will this produce? It will produce a link to this, and that HTML that's producing the link will be written into the document at this location. So that example, what it will do is it will produce exactly this rendering. Let's see it in action. So this rendering has been produced by this HTML. So this is the HTML that produced this. When this script was encountered, it was executed. It was not a function definition, it was executable code. So it was executed. So right in this spot inside the document, this was written as a link. And so this was produced. So when I click on this, then it will send me to its intended target. As we already mentioned before, JavaScripts can be inserted anywhere inside of the HTML page, but it is good practice if you create functions to place them all at the start of the document so that you can make calls to them later in the HTML page. You do not have to, but it's good practice. So in this case, what is shown is that we have two JavaScript blocks. One of them has a function definition, and the other one is just straight executable code. So it's good practice to put the definitions in the beginning so that anybody looking for them can spot them easily. Even if pieces of JavaScript code are spread throughout the HTML, they're still part of one large program located inside the document. This is what I meant earlier when I said that a variable that we defined, the counter that was auto-incremented, it lived in the entire program, and different blocks of JavaScript code could access it. Global variables can be declared at the beginning. So whenever you declare a variable outside a function, they are global, and all the JavaScript blocks have access to it, regardless of where exactly, in which block you happen to declare them. Statements are executed as the page is read by the browser. They are executed by the engine, the JavaScript engine, that the browser has. Functions are only executed if called and can be placed throughout the code. This is the summary of what we saw earlier, with code such as this, which is going to be executable upon encountering it, whereas this one, upon encountering it, all it does it finds a function definition, so it defines this function and keeps it in mind for later use. Here's another very simple example. We have here two JavaScript blocks, one that starts here and ends here. It simply contains one statement that defines a variable. Then there is another script over here which does something else, but it refers to that variable. So this is to indicate that although these are two seemingly different blocks, they are part of the same larger program. So although this variable was declared in this block, it was not inside any function or anything, therefore it's going to be a global variable. Therefore it is accessible from this block, and over here its value can be used. In fact, what this statement is going to do is when this block is encountered, this will be written to the HTML document right in this location. What will be written? It will be just the value 10 followed by a blank. The plus in string operations incidentally means concatenation. So what will this render? It will render this. So this text here will be rendered as it was meant to be, because it is renderable text inside the HTML document and outside the JavaScript blocks. So this will render as is, and you see it here. And then right at this point, dynamically, the content will be augmented to print the value of this variable followed by a blank. And then this will follow after that, and this is the rendering of it. So this part here, the 10 and the space that follows it, was dynamically inserted into the code of the document. JavaScript offers some interaction dialog windows that are basically little boxes that pop up and ask for interaction with the user. There are three kinds: the alert, the prompt, and the confirm. They are very similar, except that they differ in complexity and richness of the interaction as you progress from the alert to the confirm. They are called as functions with arguments provided to them. So the alert takes as an argument a string that will be displayed in the box, like this, for example. Alert, and then string, please enter first name. That will render this. So a pop-up box like this with the message that was given as argument will appear, and a button. The only thing you can do with this is to click on the button. Well, you could exit out too, but you can click on the button OK. That is the alert. The prompt is similar, except that it allows the user to also enter some value before clicking on OK. So you're going to have a string, which is going to be the message rendered, and then you might have an initial text in the field with which you are requesting input from the user. For example, you can declare a variable number to be whatever you obtain after a prompt that is shown to the user with the message enter a number and an initial value of 13, which the user can accept or change before submitting. So what this will render will be this. So this is a prompt. This is the message that was provided as argument. This is the initial value. But the user, although can accept the default by clicking OK, he or she could also change the value to something else and then click OK. The third form is this one that allows you to simply click on OK or to cancel. It is called the confirm, and it is called with a string argument, which is going to be the message to be displayed. Unlike the alert for the confirm, you can cancel it. So the confirm works like the alert, but it also allows you the option to cancel. Now let's talk about something else regarding these interaction dialog windows. Whenever an interaction dialog window appears, the execution of the program is paused, and only after the user clicks on OK, the execution of the program continues. If you had a prompt, in which case you were asking for input from the user, then that will be used and then the program will continue. So all three of them, they do pause the execution of the program. In the case of the confirm, because you have the option to cancel, you can stop the execution of the program altogether. These days, all browsers do understand JavaScript and can execute it, although users can disable the execution of JavaScript code. In the older days, not all browsers could understand JavaScript, so they would see the script tag. They would not know what it is, they wouldn't understand it, but in their usual practice, they would simply ignore it. But then, anything that was inside the script tags, which was JavaScript executable code, would then be rendered. It would be considered as a renderable part, which would turn very ugly. And so the standard practice was, and it still is a good idea to keep in mind, that an HTML comment tag was introduced right after the script, and it was terminated right before the script. In this case, if the browser understands the script tag, then it will also understand the JavaScript code and execute it over here. But if it didn't, then all of this code would be inside HTML commenting tags, and they would have been commented out. Something to keep in mind. Now, one of the things that you will need to deal with will be debugging. You have to debug your JavaScript code, and the way you do it is in the standard way that you debug any other program. If your JavaScript has syntax errors, then your browser will still load the page, but it will probably let you know that there were errors. Not always, it will not always tell you that, but sometimes it might not. Most browsers, however, provide support for JavaScript debugging. So debugging JavaScript has an additional advantage in that you already have debugging tools in most of the major browsers. For example, in Chrome, from the browser menu, right here, you can select more tools, this entry. This will pop up a sub-menu, and then click on developer tools. Once you bring up the developer tools, you can then select the console tab, in which you can see information about the runtime behavior of your code. The developer tools can also be used to view style sheets, divs, HTML, etc., and make changes to the code. so it's useful besides just JavaScript. In Firefox, again, you go at the menu and then you select Developer, and once this comes up, you can click on the web console once the web developer comes up. On Edge, again, you go to the menu. More tools will bring up this sub-menu, and then you click on Developer Tools. Then you can select Console. In Safari or Opera, starting with Opera, from the menu, you can select Developer and Developer Tools, then select the console. In Safari, you go to Preferences, and then you go to Advanced in the main menu. Then you check the Enable Show Developer menu in menu bar, and when the option Develop appears in the menu, then choose Show Error Console. JavaScript code can be entered directly on the console, and you can use Shift and Enter for multiple lines. It will show you syntax errors, and you can also use breakpoints like you have learned to use in debugging Java or other codes in their corresponding IDEs, and it is pretty similar in this case. Final note, JavaScript code is not secure. It's usually visible within the source of the HTML document. So do not put sensitive information in JavaScript, such as passwords, etc. Not even as notes to yourself. Do not put code in there that divulges too much information about the backend implementation of your site. Because of security reasons, you would like to keep the schema of your backend, the way it is structured, private as much as possible. You do not want to divulge that information if you do not have to. And also remember that even if you put it in a separate .js file, visitors or hackers can still find it and view it if they want and if they are just a little bit savvy. That is the end of this lesson, and thank you for watching it.